20 to 6. In the past couple of months, Sudan in northeast Africa has gone through a once-in-a-generation change. Protests, which were initially about rising prices and food shortages, became focused on Sudan's president, Omar al-Bashir. In April, after being in power for 30 years, he was ousted by the military. In his place, a military-led transitional council, which itself was the subject of protests by people who wanted civilians to be in charge. The military promised a peaceful transition to civilian rule, but today it admitted that security forces committed abuses when they attacked a protest camp this week. More than 100 people were killed. There are reports of bodies being dumped in the Nile to try to hide the real death toll. Doctors told The Guardian that more than 70 rapes may have been committed. Kate Ferguson is a co-executive director at Protection Approaches, a charity working to prevent identity-based violence. In The Guardian yesterday, she wrote these words: "Politicians and journalists frequently ask, where is the next Myanmar? Where will the next Syria be?" The deteriorating situation in Sudan now presents an urgent test case of the strength of our resolve. Kate Ferguson is here. What do you understand about what's happened there this week?
It's been very alarming. Thanks so much for having me on. I think it's incredibly important that this worsening crisis is increasingly in the media, and I really appreciate you bringing me in. As you say, what we're seeing on the streets of Khartoum is there are atrocities, and actually outside of Khartoum also we are hearing reports of villages being attacked, of people being identified as challengers and protesters to the military council being violently attacked. And it's a return of identity-based violence in Sudan, except really it never really went away. And so what we're very concerned about is the worsening of this violence, and that if the international community takes its eye off the situation, then the consequences for the Sudanese people could be very, very dire indeed.
What is identity-based violence in the context of this country?
Well, what we're seeing, Sudan is complex because you see the deliberate targeting of groups for all sorts of reasons, and that's what identity-based violence is. Whenever a group or an individual is targeted because of how that perpetrator, that attacker, conceives their identity, whether that is their religious identity, their ethnic, their cultural identity, but also often in this case, kind of assumed political allegiance. And so protesters are being attacked en masse because they are perceived to pose this threat. It's sort of a way of collective punishment. And what we know is that when left unchecked, identity-based violence, and what we're seeing now is identity-based mass violence, leads to a spiralling of atrocities. And Sudan is a country with a long history of genocide, of ethnic cleansing. And this is the concern. There is an assumption, I think, that atrocities such as genocide and ethnic cleansing, these mass atrocities, are something that is a product of armed conflict. And in fact, it's just not true. Often, identity-based mass violence, as we're seeing in Sudan, it leads to worsening crises, it leads to armed conflict.
So this is a test for the international community.
Absolutely.
How is it doing with that test so far?
Not terribly. The UK has been strong and robust in its condemnation. I think the UN Security Council has condemned in its strongest terms the violence. That is important. However, what is really needed in the response to what's happening in Sudan, these warning signs, these escalations, is a joined-up approach. And if you just take that from the perspective of the United Kingdom, which is what our organisation is chiefly concerned with, means something that all of the UK governmental departments that are internationally facing, so not just the Foreign Office, also the Department for International Development, also International Trade, also domestically our Ministry of Justice, our Home Office, must make sure that when it's making decisions with regard to Sudan and the wider region, it is thinking, how are my decisions, how are these decisions of government contributing to mitigating those concerning processes that we are seeing in the country and in the wider region. And I think that joined-up approach is needed. The problem is, as we have said again and again, the United Kingdom currently does not have a clear atrocity prevention strategy. And this is what we saw in Myanmar before. We warned, not just our organisation, many, many others, for years and decades. These are warning signs. There are communities at risk of widespread, systematic, intentional violence. And if countries like the United Kingdom do not act, if we do not have our eyes and our attentions on those warning signs, this slippage towards this disintegration of deliberate violence is not inevitable, but comes likely.
And worth saying that Omar al-Bashir, in power for 30 years, only recently ousted by the people who are now perpetrating these atrocities, he himself is wanted by the International Criminal Court over alleged war crimes in Darfur. I wonder what the chances are of anyone being held responsible and facing justice over their alleged crimes.
It's difficult, and the UK has traditionally been a strong supporter of the International Criminal Court, and it is essential that the international community continues to maintain that pressure, supports the centrality of the International Criminal Court, and supports Sudan when the time is right to develop national mechanisms of justice. However, there are things that the United Kingdom can do here to prevent this country from becoming a haven for suspected genocidaires, suspected war criminals, and also beyond that, ensuring that our financial system doesn't harbour dirty genocidaire money. So there are things that can be done in this country as well.
Thank you. Very good to see you.
Thanks
Kate
very much.
Ferguson, Co-Executive Director at Protection Approaches, which works to prevent identity-based violence.